Hello, everyone, and welcome to week number 5 of Political Economy. Hope everyone is having a good week so far. Up to this point in this class, we've been looking at several different principles and concepts behind public intervention in the provision and or production of goods and services. Beginning with this week and moving forward in the course, we'll start looking at specific policy areas and some of the unique situations of public provision and production in those unique types of policy areas. So for this week, we're going to look at a few different policy areas. One policy area we're going to look at is education policy. And you have the chapter in the textbook talking about education policy. We'll look at public provision and production of education, both K through 12, as well as higher education. We'll talk about some different delivery mechanisms and different alternative delivery mechanisms that are available, whereby you can have some aspects of privatization, whether it be vouchers or private charter types of schools, or in terms of privatization of cafeteria services, or privatization of building services, or custodial services. So we're looking at different alternative methods beyond just a pure public provision and public production of education. Then we'll also look at welfare programs and redistributive policies. And we'll talk about the public sector's role and government's role in those redistributive policies and programs. We'll talk about some of the inherent limitations on privatization with those redistributive policies. And one of the primary issues with redistributive policy is that when you are redistributing wealth from one segment of society to another, you are probably redistributing that wealth to segments of society that need that wealth redistributed to it. So therefore, you're not going to be able to charge. You don't have the chargeability in that type of a policy or program that you would normally need in order to privatize that type of a policy. We will talk about some privatization efforts in welfare programs. You have one video you'll see this week that will show you the welfare reform in the 1990s, what's known as the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, whereby we move from categorical grants such as assistance to families with dependent children, AFDC, and replace those with temporary assistance and needy family grants, again, to kind of free up states in terms of the way in which they use their welfare dollars. So we'll talk about through welfare reform, as we've kind of moved a little bit more toward inclusion of the private sector and the creation of a lot of these public-private partnerships to deal with moving people from welfare to work. Then you'll have a chapter that looks at social insurance programs. We'll spend quite a bit of time talking about things like Medicare, Social Security, and the public's role in provision and production of those programs. One thing to recognize of Social Security is that Social Security is in and of itself a redistributive type of program, in that the benefits that people are getting today, beneficiaries are getting today, those benefits are actually coming out of the paychecks of people who are currently in the workforce. That's not a situation where the money that comes out for payroll taxes out of your check goes into an account with your name on it. The money that's coming out of your check today in payroll taxes is being used to pay the benefits of people who have already retired, thus giving it that type of redistributive element, which kind of, again, makes it difficult to privatize. We'll talk about some of the different attempts at privatization, some of the different attempts at allowing people a little bit more control over managing their retirement benefits through the stock market, and allowing people to actually actively manage their retirement through the stock market as part of the Social Security system. Now, last week we talked about some of the primary criteria that we'll look at in determining whether it should be a publicly provided or a privately provided good or service. We look at the need for the program. And as you look at education policy and welfare policy and social insurance policy, think about the needs for those programs. Now, obviously, with something like Social Security, it has been around for decades, and it's been something that has been created and managed by the federal government, by the public sector. So people have a need for that program, and they have, through expectancy theory, this expectation that government will continue to be intimately involved in both the provision and the production of an entitlement program such as Social Security. We've talked a lot in this course about market failures. And so when you think about privatization versus public sector provision and production, you've got to think about, well, is it something that the private sector would choose to do? Is it something the private sector can do? So take education, for example. Obviously, the private sector can get engaged in education. However, the question then is, if you completely privatize K through 12 education, does the private sector have the wherewithal and have the capacity to provide that type of education to all children in every state around the country? Or is that something that is just logistically not possible or cost prohibitive for the private sector to engage in? We also know another criteria of these alternate forms of government intervention that's not an all or nothing type of proposition, that we have some situations where you have public production of a good or service. Sometimes the public will then contract out to a private sector vendor where they then have private production of that good or service. Sometimes we have these public-private partnerships. You think about something like homelessness policy. And when you're looking at creating houses for people who are homeless, you've got a lot of these public-private partnerships, and you can add nonprofit organizations in there as well as a type of private entity where public sector, nonprofit sector, and private sector all join together into these partnership networks in order to provide and produce those types of goods and services. Design features, again, in terms of eligibility that we talked about last week, is it an entitlement and eligibility-based type of program? If it's an entitlement and eligibility type of program, then those beneficiaries have a legal right to those benefits. And so if you're going to privatize a program like that, you have to recognize that even if those individuals don't have the money to pay for those goods and services, they are legally entitled to them. And so you can't have a private sector vendor come in and deny those goods and services to those legally eligible households and families. We've got to think about private sector responses to government programs. So if you've got the public sector deciding, as we mentioned last week, to build its own recreation center, you've got to think about how private recreation centers, how private gyms will then be affected and how they will respond to that. The consequences in terms of efficiency. So if we're going to have the government doing it, it's going to be left to public provision and public production. We might have some concerns about efficiency because we're going to have a monopolistic situation where it is the government alone that is the sole provider and producer of this good or service. Whenever you have that, you have a lack of competition. With a lack of competition, sometimes there is a lack of an imperative to be as efficient as possible. One of the main differences between public and private sectors, as you know from your time in the program, is the source of their revenue. And that with public sector organizations, the source of their revenue tends to be appropriations. Appropriations tend to be much more stable in nature than in the private sector, where your revenue comes from the sale of goods and profits. And so when you have a very stable source of revenue, such as appropriations, sometimes there's not a premium placed upon efficiency and trying to create more output with fewer inputs, at least not to the same degree as we see by profit-driven private corporations. Distributional consequences, we talked about this last week as well. Is this a good or service that needs to be provided to everyone in society? How broad does the distribution of these goods and services need to be? So think about something such as utility services. And one of the reasons why we have public utility commissions in just about every state in the country is to make sure that utility services are not rationed out to only those who can afford it, that everyone has access, because these utility services are truly staples of life. So is it something that needs to be distributed broadly across all of society? If so, you're probably going to have some type of public intervention, some type of public sector influence in terms of how much of that good is being created and who gets the benefits from that type of good. Your equity efficiency trade-offs, again, in the public sector, we're very concerned about equity. In the private sector, we're much more concerned about efficiency. If you're very concerned about equity, then you're probably going to have some element of public regulation in the provision and or production of that good or service. If you're primarily concerned with efficiency, doing more with less, providing more of the good at a lower cost, that's when you probably look more at private provision or private production. And then the accomplishment of these goals and objectives. As we know, as MPA students, public sector goals tend to be much more amorphous. They tend to be much more unclear. They tend to be much more qualitative as compared to the more quantitative, more empirical, more measurable goals and objectives in the private sector. So if the goal or the objective of the program is amorphous, if it is very vague, if it's difficult to measure, that's going to take you down the road toward more public involvement in production. If it's more quantitative, easier to measure, that will then lead you towards more of a private type of orientation for production of that good or that service. And then the politics of the whole process. How politically feasible, how politically viable is it to privatize? How politically viable is it to leave it in the government's hands? Again, this is going to depend upon the results of elections. It's going to depend upon which party is in power, both in the White House as well as in the House and the Senate. Politics will govern a lot of the decisions we make about just how extensive private involvement will be in the provision and production of goods and services. So as we look at areas such as education and social welfare redistributive programs and social insurance types of programs, think about those criteria in terms of whether it should be more of a public type of job, whether it should be more of a private responsibility, or if it should be a shared responsibility between public, private, and nonprofit sectors. So to enhance and augment your readings for this week, you also have a series of videos that are available to you in the learning activities. You have a video on market efficiencies and price signals. Again, talking about the free market economy and our predisposition in this country to the invisible hand of the free market, allowing your supply and demand curves to determine what is being produced and how much of that good will be produced. You can contrast that free market invisible hand kind of Adam Smith approach to a more centrally planned economy, like we sometimes see in more European nations, where government determines what is being produced and how much of that good or service should be produced. And then again, the advantages and disadvantages of both of those different types of approaches. Productive efficiency is also covered in the video. The idea that we want to get the greatest output for the least input. Again, that's our basic definition of efficiency. Also, it touches upon the idea of rational self-interested actor theory, that individuals are rational self-interested actors, and so therefore they want to maximize their benefits while minimizing their costs. As Milton Friedman said, nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as they spend their own money. Allocative efficiency looks at the production and how it represents consumer preferences. So are we allocating these programs and allocating these goods and services in alignment with the preferences of our consumers and our citizens? Another video you'll watch this week, price control, subsidies, and risk of good intentions. Ask the normative question about should government ever set prices, set price ceilings, set price floors. Again, think about something like utilities. We have public utility commissions, and those public utility commissions will approve rate hikes for utilities. They will essentially set the prices for these utility companies. Again, they do that to make sure there's not a rationing of utility services, to make sure you have distributional equity of those services throughout all different strata, all different segments of the economy. We know that government gets involved in terms of subsidizing the production of goods and services. As we talked about in an earlier video, they typically get involved in subsidizing the production of goods and services for goods that result in a positive externality. Goods that result in a positive externality tend to be underproduced, So therefore, government gets involved to subsidize that production so that we will get more of those positive externalities. That's oftentimes a good thing for government to do, but we have to recognize that there are also unintended consequences. That type of government subsidy could certainly distort the market, because the market may define that here is the amount of this good that should be produced. Then government comes in and subsidizes the production to produce more of that good or service. That then knocks your supply and demand curve out of tilt with each other. So they kind of go out of balance with each other, and it distorts your invisible hand of the free market of the economy. So again, government trying to do a good thing by enhancing the production of goods that result in positive externalities, but there could be some unintended consequences and distortion effects when government does that. We've got another video that kind of goes back and recaps the idea of market failures, reviews positive and negative externalities, reviews government subsidies. Then again, you can take this information and then apply it to our particular policy areas for this week: social insurance, social welfare, and education policy. Kind of ties all those concepts together. Okay. Environmental economics, you have a video looking at the economics of environmental regulation, and that's a very timely topic, of course, especially in terms of climate change and global warming. Talks about some of the investments and the cost of investment now compared to hopefully some of the value that it will add in the future. Economics of education video, looking at, again, public versus private provision and production of education. We have videos that introduce you to things such as charter schools, the concept of what a charter school is. There's a lot of misunderstanding about charter schools. Here in California, there are different types of charter schools. Some charter schools are publicly governed charter schools, some are not. In a publicly governed type of charter school, the charter school's budget resides with the school district. So the school district has control, fiscal control, over the charter school's budget. Those are fiscally dependent charter schools that are really governed by that public school district. Then there's another type of charter school that are more fiscally independent. Those charter schools have their own independent budget that they're able to create, that they're able to manage on their own, outside of the normal operations of the school district. So not all charter schools are created equal. Then you also have a video talking about vouchers and the experiment with vouchers in education policy and some of the advantages and disadvantages of vouchers. One of the primary advantages of vouchers is their portability. And that if you have portable vouchers, you can then have parents that can take those vouchers and use them at a variety of different schools, even outside of the jurisdiction in which they live. Meant to enhance competition by giving parents a lot more choice in terms of where they send their children. But you have that video talking about vouchers, and you'll explore that concept of vouchers again in your written assignment for this week as well. And inherent within this discussion, obviously, is this question of what is the impact of competition on education? Does competition improve, or does competition hurt public education? Then you also have a video looking at social policy, and again, looking at this idea of the transition in welfare reform from AFDC grants to temporary assistance to needy family grants, what those two grants were about, and how we transition to try and provide more flexibility to how money is being spent to move people from welfare to work. In the wake of the passage of the welfare reform in the mid-1990s, we had some states that were extremely successful at moving people from welfare to work. The primary causal factor for success in moving people from welfare to work was the economy. And in some states, they had a burgeoning economy in the mid-1990s. They had a lot of jobs being created, and so it just made it very easy for them to be successful in moving people from welfare to work. One of those states, North Dakota, is a great example. They had an exploding oil industry that was going on in the 1990s, and they were actually sending out advertisements over state lines to incentivize people to move to North Dakota to work in the oil industry because they had more jobs than they had people. You have more jobs than you have people, you can certainly reduce your welfare rolls pretty quickly as compared to other states that didn't have that same type of economic opportunity. There's a video on Social Security and talking about the market solution of Social Security, essentially allowing people to invest their own money in the stock market, at least a portion of their Social Security proceeds into the stock market, and manage their own investments. That's the market solution to the Social Security problem. Social Security obviously has struggled for many years with this problem of solvency. And every few years, we put together a blue ribbon commission. And a blue ribbon commission is then supposed to come up with ways to make Social Security more solvent further into the future. Because depending upon which study you read, some studies will say Social Security will become insolvent by the year 2030. Some will say 2040. Some will say 2050. So we are always trying to find ways to make Social Security fiscally solvent, at least for decades into the future. And obviously, every time this market solution is one of the solutions that's always offered. So you've got a lot of those different types of videos talking about different topics that can help supplement some of your reading for this week, as well as supplement some of the things that we've talked about in this video and that we'll wrap up next week in our week 6 video as well. Your culminating assignment for this week is a written assignment. And this written assignment, you're going to focus primarily on the provision and production of K through 12 education. You're going to look at public provision and production of K through 12 education and then analyze some of the various alternatives that exist to pure public provision and production. So things such as vouchers, things such as privatization of different types of services within the school setting. In the paper, you'll analyze how these alternatives are affected by the wealth of communities and what impact wealth has on the demand for education and marginal utility. One of the things you'll be looking at is, again, different jurisdictions, different communities have different fiscal capacities. So if you have a jurisdiction, you have a school district that has a very strong fiscal capacity in that the assessed valuation of property in that district is very high, then, they'll have the opportunity to become what we refer to here in California as a base funding district. Base funding districts do not rely upon state appropriations to fund education, but rather they rely upon their own taxes. They rely upon the collection of property taxes from the assessed valuation of property within their jurisdiction. So a district like the Santa Monica Malibu district is an example of a base funding district. Then you have other districts that obviously don't have the same fiscal capacity as the Santa Monica Malibu district. And they cannot be base funding districts, and they have to rely upon state appropriations. So are there different alternative approaches? Do vouchers work better in high wealth areas? Do they work better in low wealth areas? What impact does the wealth of the community have on the efficiency and effectiveness of some of these alternatives to pure public provision and production of education? As you're putting your paper together, you will want to locate at least 4 peer-reviewed journal articles and use those 4 peer-reviewed journal articles to support the arguments that you're making in the paper about the different alternatives that you are analyzing and how you are analyzing those alternatives. Be sure to not only include concepts from those 4 peer-reviewed journal articles, but also include theories and concepts from the books and the videos offered in the course as well. So what are some of the alternatives to public provision and production of education? And what does it mean for different communities of different capabilities and different levels of wealth? So that's your written assignment for this week. And those are all the videos you'll be watching. Those are the chapters that you'll be reading. But again, this week really kicks off our movement into specific policy areas, looking at public provision and production in all these different policy areas. So I hope that this video has been helpful to get you going for this week. If you have any questions about the assignment or any questions about any of the readings that you're doing, As always, feel free to reach out to me, send me an email, and I'm more than happy to answer any of your questions. Otherwise, I look forward to reading your paper for this week, and I hope everyone has a very good and productive week. And I'll talk to you again in our introductory video for week number 6.